Welcome to The Inside Story. I'm Billy Hollowell, and today I am joined by John Brown of the Christian Post to talk about the horrific aftermath of Hurricane Helene. How you doing today, John?
I'm hanging in there, Billy. Good to talk to you.
Well, it's good to talk with you. I know that you recently, and you're still there now, headed to North Carolina, and you were there when the hurricane hit. There's obviously been Hurricane Milton since that happened, but we're going to focus today on North Carolina and what has happened there. Let's just start with what you have seen and experienced in the aftermath of this storm.
Right, so I'm visiting my family here for a few weeks, and I didn't pick the best time to do it, obviously. I woke up the Friday of the hurricane as it was moving out, and I got to see a tree, narrowly missed the house. Thankfully, we were largely spared of any nasty destruction, but I started to drive around that morning. I couldn't get anywhere, down trees everywhere. There was no internet, no cell signal. Every route out of where I was staying was blocked, and it actually took a couple days for the water to recede enough so that I could get on the interstate and head east.
Wow. That's actually terrifying to be in a moment like that where you can't find a way out. What does that feel like when you're in the midst of that? Even though you feel like, okay, the storm itself maybe is the intensity of it's over, but the aftermath not allowing you to do a basic thing like exit or enter a location.
Well, I wouldn't say I was frightened, but it was very surreal because I realized, wow, I really cannot go to the places where I'm used to going. All the grocery stores were closed, all the gas stations were closed. There was no gas for more than a week, and it felt very dystopian for sure.
You had obviously evacuated, returned. The scene in and near Asheville, other locations. I mean, we are hearing catastrophic stories. What have been some of the things that you've seen or heard that have just rocked you to your core?
I think some of the worst stories I've heard were in the Swannanoa area, which is where I used to go to school, and I used to actually live there. Just entire houses picked up and swept away down the river. There was one story where there was a house that was floating, and no one recognized the house, and they realized it was a few communities north. It had just totally been carried down the river, and of course, there are stories of bodies floating, bodies in the trees, people finding those. I have been told that by multiple people. Thankfully, I didn't see a lot of that with my own eyes, but I know that it happened.
My goodness. And, from a human perspective, you're there now, you're covering stories, but this is a community that's near and dear to you, as again, this is where you grew up, where your parents live, where your family lives. From a human perspective, not just a journalism perspective, what has been the hardest part for you, especially those personal connections in hearing these stories of loss, not just loss of property, but as you were mentioning, loss of life?
Well, I did stay with friends for a week, and then I'm now back, and I've been able to drive through some of these places where I grew up and where I used to hang out, and some of these places are just totally gone. Places like Chimney Rock, Lake Lure, they're just gone, and I've actually heard they're pulling hundreds of bodies out of that lake every day. Um, it's
Wow.
just it's just devastation. And the fact the weather is so beautiful right now just makes it even more surreal. And some of these places, they're never going to be the same. I don't know how they can rebuild somewhere like Biltmore Village right outside the Biltmore estate. That those buildings are just gutted. They were totally underwater. And there's a lot of spiritual darkness in Asheville, and it was already reeling in recent years over rising violent crime. A lot of police were quitting, and I was already seeing some of my favorite places just overrun with lawlessness. And now to see them destroyed by this natural disaster, it almost feels like a physical manifestation of something spiritual, and it just really makes me sad.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to see, and obviously you're there, you're dealing with it firsthand, and having again that I can't emphasize enough that personal connection to the area adds another level to it. When you look at your own upbringing, the school you went to, and I'm not going to name the school, but the high school, that school alone suffered a lot of money and damage. What happened there?
Right. Well, I can name it's Asheville Christian Academy, and it was in the Swannanoa area, and I went there, and Franklin Graham also went there. And Fox News, they were on Fox News, and Fox News reported that there's about $15 million worth of damage to that campus, which of course is just catastrophic. It was right up against the river that flooded, and so it has three big buildings. they were all flooded, and all of their athletic fields, of course, were badly damaged. And I actually had to break the news to Franklin when I interviewed him that our mutual high school was destroyed, and he was very saddened by that.
Well, again, it's like these places that you assume will always be there. They're memories, right? Where all of your memories were made. To know that they've been destroyed in that way or harmed in that way, it's heartbreaking. And you mentioned obviously interviewing Franklin Graham. His organization, Samaritan's Purse, has been on the ground as they always are when disaster hits. What were some of the takeaways from that conversation with him? The things that struck you the most about his reflections on what he is seeing and experiencing?
Yeah, well, this is very personal for him too. He was born here in Asheville. He grew up in nearby Montreat, which is less than 20 miles east. That's where his father lived most of his life. And his non Samaritan's Purse is his nonprofit, and they're based in Boone, which is not that far either, and they're helping out with relief efforts. But I think it was surreal for Franklin because he and his nonprofit, they help people all over the world, and now they're helping people in his own backyard. And I spoke to him last week, as I said, and his own house in Boone still did not have electricity. And so he's struggling with all of this too. This is hitting everybody.
Yeah, and of course, as there always is, there are controversies and claims being made. Some false claims, other claims. People aren't sure what to make of them. And it's an election year. You're just weeks away from the most contentious election in American history. And unfortunately, when an event like this strikes so close to an election, it's going to be politicized by everyone involved. That's just something you expect. And unfortunately, there have been claims that that is what is happening here. But one of the things that we have heard are allegations that FEMA and the government response has not been up to par, has not been what it should have been. I know this is a complicated issue, but what is the truth? What do we know about those particular claims?
I'm not entirely sure what is true, and I think that's part of the story regarding the gripes about FEMA. I mean, obviously FEMA's track record is not the best, looking back on disasters in Maui, Ohio, and that doesn't really help people trust them. I've had people tell me that they haven't seen FEMA or that they showed up way too late. And of course, there are these reports that they're actively impeding private rescue efforts. There was a report in the New York Post earlier this week that said FEMA officials told this woman they couldn't help her because they weren't allowed to go around a road closed sign, even though everybody else was. And that was in Batcave, which is not far from me. And those people have gotten to the point where they said they don't even want FEMA there. I'm not able to speak to that personally, but I think the bigger picture here is that many Americans have lost total faith in their federal government, and many actually see them as a malicious force at this point. And that makes it easy for people to believe some of the worst rumors going around, whether they're true or not. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent.
Well, yeah, and I think this is why communication is so key and clarity. And at the end of the day, these organizations like Samaritan's Purse and Operation Blessing and these other groups that are out there doing that work on the ground, those private organizations, they do such phenomenal work. And, I'm sure that, we know for a fact that those organizations are helping people there. And so you want to see FEMA do a good job. I think it's often hard for the government to mobilize. And, we see this in other areas of government as well. So we'll continue to monitor that because I think people are still trying to understand. And I think you said it very aptly. The uncertainty of those allegations is part of the story. But just as we round this out, how can people be praying right now based on what you're seeing, what you're reporting on, and what you know is happening there firsthand?
I would just encourage people to be praying that God would somehow use all this suffering for good. These rural regions around here, they were already largely struggling with despair and feeling forgotten. And I think this storm has just made things much worse. There was a report yesterday from uh, Nick Sorto that he's a prominent journalist on Twitter. He's here. He said that the suicide rate is spiking in this area and has started to really become a crisis as people lose hope since the storm. And I asked Franklin what he would say to people who are doubting God's goodness through all of this. And he said, we don't always have the answers for why God allows stuff like this to happen, but that the Bible teaches that God loves us, He cares for us through all of it. And I would just encourage people to pray that these people can really experience that.
Well, I so appreciate you, John, taking the time. We are praying for you, your loved ones, and for the entire community there in the wake of Hurricane Helene. I appreciate you joining me today.
Thanks, Billy.
Everyone else, make sure you head on over to the Christian Post where you can continue reading coverage on this horrific storm and its aftermath. As for this show, we will be back again next week. We'll see you then.